the big money here is coming from employer NICs, and it is progressive, but it is absolutely going to hit working people on lower middle incomes as well as people at the top. And actually, the way they've done the employer NICs increase, it's more on lower middle income people than you would have got from other direct tax increases like income tax, or just by increasing the rate. So maybe it's politically one of the ways they thought he'd get a bit more tax on middle earners without making it look like it was a bit more tax on middle earners.
Hello and welcome to this post-budget edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Ben Zaranko and Helen Miller to talk about the tax and spending and public finance decisions that Rachel Reeves has made in her first budget as Chancellor. In many ways, it's a big budget compared with what we were expecting or what was penciled in by Jeremy Hunt back in March. We've got something like £40 billion worth of tax increases, at least that's what it says in the budget scorecard, and £70 billion worth of spending increases. So that sounds all very big and exciting. It may not feel quite like that, not least because a lot of what the Chancellor is doing, as she herself has said, is repairing some of the inheritance, and a lot of that spending up front will be just to stop things falling over, to stop the justice system falling over, to stop local government going bust, to stop waiting lists in the NHS getting any bigger. As we'll also discuss, most of this money is coming this year and next, and there are concerns about how much will be available after that. On the tax side, this looks remarkably like a different Chancellor to the one who promised not to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT before the election, but we'll delve into the likely effects of those tax changes as we go into the rest of the podcast. It's also worth saying that, contrary to usual experience from Chancellors inheriting difficult fiscal situations, Rachel Reeves did actually increase planned spending on investment in the hope that this will provide long-term benefits to the economy, benefits which unfortunately for her we're unlikely to see over this Parliament, but which might nevertheless be good for the economy in the longer run. So that, I think, is broadly where we are on the tax and spending. But let's dive into that a little bit more. And perhaps it's worth starting with that question of how tough was this inheritance. Rachel Reeves talked rather a lot, as you may have noticed, about the $22 billion, the so-called $22 billion black hole. She says that these tax increases and so on are all the fault of the last lot. Ben, to what extent, how big were the constraints on the Chancellor as she stood up to deliver her budget? And given all the trade-offs, how broadly has she managed them?
Well, Rachel Reeves is a politician, and she's playing politics when she's playing up how bad the inheritance is and how it's all somebody else's fault. She has a bit of a point. The fiscal inheritance is really pretty dreadful. It's a bit of a hospital pass from Jeremy Hunt. I think that it was apparent to lots of us ahead of the election that it was going to be a difficult, probably a tax-raising budget. Things arguably are a little bit worse than that, given some of the extent of those in-year pressures that hadn't been accounted for. Faced with that, I think it's commendable that they've prioritised investment and not slashed it as the first thing to go when times are tough, as lots of her predecessors have. That focus on the long term is a good thing, and we should all hope it bears fruit. On the public services side of things, she inherited plans that would have seen some quite big cuts to lots of areas of government over the next few years through a combination of a bit of extra borrowing and a lot of extra tax. She is pumping extra cash in this year and next. This is very much not an austerity budget. Lots of areas will see some really quite big increases, including areas like the justice system, which don't usually tend to win in these negotiations. But she's left herself with a tricky set of decisions further down the line, where the spending plans look much tighter, and she'll be facing some delicate choices in the spring that her cabinet colleagues may not be too pleased about.
Well, I'm sure we'll come on to those difficult spending decisions in a while. It really is worth spelling out that, in a sense, the rather surprising thing of this budget is £40 billion of tax increases And the public finances still look pretty iffy in the sense that Chancellor set herself a target of borrowing only to invest. She's meeting that by the tiniest of margins, and only then because she's saying she's going to be very tight on spending going forward, and pretending that she'll increase fuel duties and so on, as predecessors have done over many years. And had she kept to the previous Chancellor's debt rule, that debt should be falling in 5 years' time, and if she hadn't redefined debt, she'd be breaking that rule as well. So lots and lots of tax increases, but actually still high levels of borrowing and high levels of debt. Again, we might say a word or two about that later on, but it's an important piece of context. But perhaps let's start with those 40 billion of tax increases. In fact, Helen, is it 40 billion?
Not really. So 40 billion is clearly the big headline number, and it's what you're going to get when you read the scorecard. It just so happens that...
So we'll say what the scorecard is.
Yeah, so the scorecard is, in the budget, there is a table of measures that the government announces, and at the bottom is the line that everyone, people like us look at to say what's the effect of the budget in terms of revenue. So if you look at that table of measures in the budget, then you're going to see the big 40 billion number. The issue is that it just so happens with employer NICs, because of the way it is scored in these budgets, there's no trickery here, there's nothing surprising, it's just the way it's done. The full effects of NICs doesn't show up on the scorecard, on the budget's table measure. It partly shows up in the broader OBR forecasts. Basically what's happening is that employer NICs necessarily has knock-on effects. Either you have to take it out of profits, and therefore you have a lower corporate tax base, you take it out of wages, you have a lower income tax base, you kind of lose some of the revenue. Once you knock that off, which the OBR has done for us, just in another part of the document, you actually have a tax rise closer to 30 billion. So it's still big. Taxes are still going to be rising. So they could be the highest share of national income ever in the UK, just not quite as big as they looked on the scorecard. So everyone's talking about 40. I think talking about something close to 30 is probably a better guide.
And the reason, of course, for that is that, and there's been lots of discussion about this is an increasing employer national insurance, but a large part of the impact of that is that employers will reduce, relative to what they otherwise would have been, the wages of their employees, and therefore less employee national insurance, less income tax, and so on being paid. And I think this is one of the reasons why some people have got a bit frustrated with what the government's been saying. They're saying no taxes on working people, and they're right. This won't come directly out of people's pay packets, but it absolutely will have an effect on people's take-home pay.
I mean, the thing to always remember is, in some ways, kind of stepping back, is that taxes are always paid by people, ultimately. The question is always just which people. So, partly, this could be partly borne through lower profits and therefore lower incomes for shareholders. But you're right, we expect most of it to be passed through to workers, and therefore for workers to be getting less income. Also, I can't resist but mentioning in passing, I think there's been a lot of hoo-ha about, is it on working people, and does that mean it's a manifesto pledge? I think it's all a bit of a sideshow, to be honest. The manifesto was really clear, no rise in national insurance. We had a rise in national insurance, just very clearly. Whether it's on working people or not is kind of you could debate either way if you want to. It is, but in some ways, regardless of what you come down on that, it's a breach of the manifesto pledge. She wrote, Rachel Reeves chose to increase national insurance contributions. It's very straightforward.
And earlier this week, Keir Starmer gave a speech where he said something like, I have long said that politicians need to be honest with the public about the trade-offs they face and the reality that you can't have things for nothing. And knocked me back. I was like, this is the same Keir Starmer who a few short months ago was saying that we don't need any more tax rises. It'll all be paid for through growth. No problem here. It's absolutely wrong to say we'll be increasing income tax, national insurance or VAT, but yet here we are.
Yeah, it's a horrible game, politics, isn't it? For the things that politicians feel they need to say to get elected. I mean, given where we are, it seems to me that there was very little choice about raising one of income tax, national insurance or VAT, but the manifesto shouldn't have ruled that out. It's much better to do that and raise this kind of money than try and fiddle around with lots and lots of other very complicated taxes. But it's absolutely a significant tax rise. It's worth just stepping back and saying this was a big tax increasing budget. The last parliament was a big tax increasing parliament. The size of the state is growing. The size of the state grew over the last parliament. It's going to grow over this parliament. We are moving more towards the sorts of tax and spending levels you see in many other Western European countries. We're not there yet, but in the end, we couldn't hold back the tide of the ever-growing demands on the welfare state, I suppose.
Though it's not just about the levels of tax, is it? We look quite different to Western European countries in where we get that tax from, which I think in yesterday's budget plays into in an interesting way, in the sense that, I mean, I don't know why I'm looking at Helen while I rehearse Helen's work back to her, but, lots of European countries raise much more in payroll taxes and social security contributions for middle earners. And yesterday, I suppose, takes us a bit more in that direction also.
Yeah. I mean, it speaks to your point, Paul, right? I mean, we are getting more European in the levels. One thing we said lots of times before is that we've been increasing taxes a lot at the top. And if you just looked at the budget set of measures, a lot of them are aimed more at the top, at wealth, at, certain kinds of broad-shouldered people, I guess. But the big money here is coming from employer NICs, and it is progressive, but it is absolutely going to hit working people on lower middle incomes as well as people at the top. And actually, the way they've done the employer NICs increase, it's more on lower middle income people than you would have got from other direct tax increases like income tax, or just by increasing the rate. So maybe it's politically one of the ways they thought he'd get a bit more tax on middle earners without making it look like it was a bit more tax on middle earners.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, let's just talk about that very briefly, because it hasn't got a lot of coverage. So what happened with national insurance, employer national insurance contributions? The main rate was raised from 13.8 to 15%, but actually the bigger increase was to reduce from about £9,100 a year to about £5,000 a year, the point at which those national insurance contributions start to get paid, which on the face of it is quite a regressive way of doing it, because that means proportionally the employer cost of employing low earners goes up more than the cost of employing high earners. Why do you think they went in that direction? Why do it like that?
Yeah. Well, sort of the pedant in me, I think it's less progressive rather than outright regressive.
Good point.
But yes, yes. I mean, we don't know why they've done it like that. I think there are a few things to take into account. One is the point I just made about who are you trying to raise taxes from, and it is a way relative to other measures of getting a bit more from the middle than you would have done if you'd just done a straight rate rise. And if you think that nowadays, for political reasons, you can't raise taxes at the top in the sort of straightforward ways, maybe it's another way of doing it. But I'm speculating on the political motives there. The other thing is kind of maybe the trade-off around kind of work incentives and things like that. So if you'd have just done this all through the rate rise, you'd have had to go up further than 15. If you start looking at top, overall combined levels of tax on income, the top rate we've got is already over 54%. It would go up even higher. So thinking about labour supply decisions at the top, how much you want to work, you'd have been doing quite a lot there. You might worry about it at that point of distribution. Maybe you worry less about it lower down the distribution. Although worth saying, as we pointed out today, the employer NICs rise is coming alongside an increase in minimum wages. It's quite a big increase in employer costs, between the last couple of years. That means a couple of things. On the one hand, the government might be hoping that that will protect some low-income workers because you've put their taxes up, but maybe employers can't pass it through on their wages because their wages are protected. So on the one hand, you might be thinking, well, this is good. We'll protect some of these low-income guys with a minimum wage. On the other hand, you've increased the risk that they won't pass it through lower wages. They'll just not have more job. You'll get job loss. But there could be a bit of a gamble there about, sort of protect, put the tax on lower wage, on lower income, lower earning to people, but minimum wage to sort of stop it being passed through. But there is some risk there, I think. So I don't know why I've done that combination. It is kind of interesting, and it does matter.
That is interesting, and actually it's very interesting you quote that number of 54% as what the top rate of tax on earned income was. People often think, well, it's 45%, but of course it's 45% income tax. There's a couple of percent of employee national insurance on top of that, and then that's applied to income after the employer national insurance has been paid. So more than half. It's effective marginal rate of more than 50% on earnings.
If you include student loans, as you could, it goes even higher, right? I pay an extra 9% on all my earnings.
You're not a 45p payer, though. We don't pay that well at the IFS. Right. I hope you don't mind me giving away that bit of your personal information.
I don't think that gives away that much, actually, Paul.
Well, for people out there who aren't used to thinking of these top marginal rates, I think one way to see the effect of this is if you're imagining an employer a business and they're deciding whether to employ another person or to reshape the kind of job they're doing and offer a contract to a self-employed person, then if you're employing somebody, you've got to find the money to pay the employer national insurance. And now you've got to find more money. If you're contracted with a self-employed person, that's not true. That 15% wedge is really big. It's a really big difference in the cost of engaging with somebody. So we already had a big tax penalty on employment relative to other ways of getting income, including self-employment, and that's gone up now because of the employer national insurance. And that's not a statement about incidence and who ends up ultimately paying it. I'm saying something broader, which is whoever pays the tax. It's a big difference between whether you happen to be self-employed or employed.
And there's the employment regulations coming in at the same time. If you're a business making a hiring decision, there's a lot to take into account there. Could conceivably push people away from hiring extra workers at the lower end of the wage spectrum. Yeah,
and that is tricky, right? But we've seen a big increase in self-employment in the UK in recent decades. And there's a tendency to say, well, this is good, it's some kind of flourishing of entrepreneurship. And there's maybe a little bit of that going on, but a lot of it doesn't look like that at all. And if it's the tax system and regulations that are pushing people into a form of work that's less productive or comes with less employment rights, that's not obviously a good thing at all. So there is a danger that you put up minimum wages, you put up employment regulations, you put up employment taxes, you make employment a less attractive proposition for both sides of the markets. One of the things you do is you just get less employment, not just through job loss completely, but through people organising themselves through self-employment, and that's not obviously a good thing.
Well, we've said quite a lot about the employer national insurance change for obvious reasons, because it is by far the biggest change in the budget. There were an awful lot of other tax changes, which we are not, dear listener, going to go through in detail, because we would maintain you here for a very long time if we did. Broadly speaking, what Labour said in its manifesto it would do, it is doing. It's increasing the tax on, it's essentially abolishing the non-dom regime. It's increasing tax on private schools. It says it's going to get a chunk of money from reducing evasion and avoidance. But there are two other things I just wanted to mention briefly. The first, maybe three other things. The first is there wasn't anything in here really which looked like a strategy for tax reform. There was a corporate tax roadmap which basically says we think everything's fine. There was some fiddling around with the rates of capital gains tax, but no serious reform there. There was, astonishingly, in my view, an increase in stamp duty on second properties, which will further reduce transactions in the property market and probably in part result in higher rents as the number of houses available for rent declines over time. And then also, I thought rather surprisingly, given the scale of everything else that was happening, there was yet another freeze in fuel duty at a significant cost. And as ever, the promise that, honestly, it will go up again next year. Go up next year. Again, it hasn't gone up for about 15 years now, even in line with inflation. Helen, is it fair to criticise the government this early in about lack of a sort of coherent strategy or reform? Perhaps we should wait till next time and give them one more chance.
It's clearly open for debate. I think it's fair to criticise them on the basis that
right.
They had. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. So I think that they had quite a long time in opposition. It's not like they weren't thinking about what they might like to do. They had plenty of time sitting on those back benches thinking about what they might like to do.
Sitting on the opposition benches.
Thinking about what they might like to do with these things. And look, I was never thinking that Rachel was going to come in and be like, right, I'm going to introduce the IFS plan for the entire tax system. I mean, clearly that was going to be mad. But you'd like to think that one of the issues, you could have picked one and started somewhere, especially since, take capital gains tax, loads of speculation over summer was basically allowed to build up about what was going to be happening to capital gains tax. I'm almost certain that when the data's in, we're going to see lots of assets having been sold in advance of the expected changes in capital gains tax. We've been talking to Treasury literally my entire career, which is more than a few years, about how you reform properly capital gains tax. So Rachel Reeves would have entered a Treasury that was absolutely ready to go on what you might be able to do. You'd obviously have to pin down things in the fine print, but there were definitely things that she could have done actually relatively simply. She also could have said, "I'm going to do this. We'll consult on some details, but we're going to put down our plan." So I think there is room for some criticism about. You did quite a lot to tax. It looks to me, when you look down the scorecard, that mostly what they did was say, OK, we've set ourselves these constraints in the manifesto with these tax locks. where can we just scrape some money? Let's just keep getting it from somewhere. And they scrape quite a lot of money, right? But that's not let's look at it. And if you're going to go for capital gains tax, how do you do it in a way that's not as damaging for growth? Or if you're going to go, and so on and so on. So, yeah, hopefully they'll do something next budget. But it's not going to be easier next budget, is it? They've had a little bit more time in the Treasury, but they're going to be a bit closer to the next election. And it's going to still be politically difficult to do some of these things. And some of the things they've already kind of started working on. So yeah, I hope they do a better job next time. I would have liked a government, coming in for the first 14 years to have a bit like a sense of we've got a plan for tax.
To be slightly kinder, perhaps, right? There is limited bandwidth among people, and there's a hell of a lot in this budget. If you're, overhauling the fiscal framework, if you're doing a huge investment plan, you try to do a spending review. You got another one on the horizon in the spring. If you're doing the biggest package of tax raising measures in decades, maybe you just didn't have the time and the space and the resources to properly get into it. Maybe there will be more on the horizon, but I do agree that the strategy doesn't seem to be much more at the moment than what can we get away with rather than what we're trying to achieve.
Also, to be nice, there were a few little things there to like. Some of the paring back of inheritance tax relief, so give them a tick for that. There's some stuff there.
I think farmers aren't giving them much of a tick.
No, although on that, I think the big thing, the headline on that is that you can debate whether or not to have an inheritance tax. That's fine. If you're going to have an inheritance tax, it is a bit odd to be carving out certain assets. It creates all sorts of problems. So I think removing reliefs and making it a more equal treatment across assets has a lot to be said for it. And we could talk about the fact that actually people can still pass on millions of pounds in farms, and most farms aren't going to be affected. But I think there were some little bits of reform here and there, so it wasn't all bad. But there definitely wasn't a kind of a big bang kind of coming in like we've got a plan. We're going to we are pushing up growth taxes to the highest level ever, but we're going to make them more growth friendly. It was just we found some money.
Fine. Well, let's move away from tax. Sorry, Helen, and talk a little bit about spending. And Ben, the thing that was so two big stories on spending, I think. One on the capital side and one on the day-to-day spending side. And as we've said, on the capital side, quite striking that the Chancellor has looked properly to the long term by maintaining capital spending as a fraction of national income, and really won't see the benefits till well past the end of this Parliament. But on the day-to-day side, the thing that was really took me aback, I really was really surprised by this, was significant increases this year, reasonable increases next year, and then very, very slow increases after that. So very front-loaded in the terms that we use. So in principle, lots of money immediately, and then not quite back to austerity, certainly back to very, very poor growth.
I think there's a generous interpretation and there's a more cynical interpretation. And I think, given that we normally tend to the cynical, I'm going to start with the more generous one, which is that this government hasn't just inherited a difficult public finance situation. It's inherited lots of public services really struggling. Councils declaring bankruptcy, NHS waiting lists through the roofs, A&E departments struggling at winter, prisons overflowing, courts with the roofs caving in and having to throw out cases because there's no legal aid lawyer there. Things aren't in a good way across large parts of the public realm. And I think the idea seems to be that you can pump in some cash in the short term, we can burn through some of those temporary backlogs, those temporary problems, get things back on their feet, and then maybe we can return to some degree of normality, much lower rates of funding growth from a higher level. Possible. I think that the slightly more cynical interpretation is, well, actually, this one isn't so cynical. They need some quick wins. If you're going to whack up taxes by the biggest amount in decades, you really need people to see that they feel like they're getting something for that. And then the most cynical interpretation is the only reason they're meeting their fiscal rule to be meeting all day-to-day spending out of revenues in the final year is because they've penciled in quite tight spending plans in the same manner that previous governments have. In the past, we've called that gaming the rule. This time, I think it's not quite so bad as that because it comes after an initial funding injection, but I just can't see those plans being stuck to. I think they'll get revised, and they'll get revised upwards.
And just to give a sense of scale from memory, and correct me if I'm wrong, day-to-day public service spending is rising by 4.3% this year, 2.4% next year, and then just 1.3% in all the years after that. And I think your calculation suggests that if you really going to stick to 1.3% for those years after 2025, 26, you're going to struggle to make that into any kind of increase on the new baseline for quite a lot of the so-called unprotected departments. And indeed, you might even have to have a few cuts there. Now, I don't think that's what's going to happen, but that's an illustration of how tight that is off, admittedly, a higher baseline.
Yeah, it would feel a little bit odd to me to pump loads of money in and go, look, great guys, we've fixed the courts, we've fixed the prisons, we've fixed local government, time to start cutting again. That would be strange. So I don't think anyone really expects that to happen, but I think that you've got to also remember that this is a multi-stage negotiation process, and just because those are the numbers in now, governments have a tendency when they get to the business of actually allocating pots, they decide that they want more money after all. Departments get in the ear of the Prime Minister, write letters and then release them to the papers in an unhelpful way and bounce the Treasury into extra spending. So I would be surprised if come the spring those budgets look the same. There might be a low-ball initial offer, but they haven't got much room to play with within the fiscal rules, so they can't bump up those budgets by a lot unless the economy turns out to do much better or something like that.
And is it worth? I mean, for the people who aren't seeping in this stuff the way we are, I mean, big
like
picture,
our listeners.
Exactly. Well, yeah, for the few listeners who aren't, I mean, big picture. I'm going to simplify a little bit. What's happening here is that in some ways the inheritance was so dire that the spending cuts penciled in were so big that you did 40, I think 30, but you did a big increase in taxes. And that was only really enough to get you standing still on the spending side. Like, it wasn't really enough to open the spending taps. So what Rachel Reeves has done in the short run is borrow some money to do a bigger increase in spending. You can't do that permanently for all sorts of reasons, including your fiscal rule. So the gamble is you do it for a couple of years, you basically borrow to boost spending, and you hope, like the way Ben set out, that you can turn some temporary problems around, fix some things. And by the time you get 2 years down the road, either you've done enough good stuff that actually it's all okay now and think you can have a tight settlement, or by that point, people are really happy with you and you can raise a bit more tax or something's gone well in the world. But, I think this disconnect between why are taxes going up so much and why is it all still really tight is because you had to do quite a lot on tax just to stand still in the public sector. You've used borrowing on day-to-day spending in the short run, but you can't do that in the long run. And therefore, in 3 years' time, you've still got the same problem you had. You've only just got about tax revenue. You've got just about tax revenue meeting day-to-day spending. It's just not giving you very much room for manoeuvre, right? That's kind of what's happening at a big picture here.
Though, we could get lucky on growth. We could get lucky on debt interest spending. If interest rates fall back faster than we expect, we could get, it depends on your interpretation, but we could get, from a fiscal perspective, lucky on disability and welfare benefits. Maybe they won't rise quite as fast as we're expecting if the population gets healthier. There's all sorts of ways.
Of course, although I'm
there's
loving the
upside.
optimism, you could also get unlucky in the sense that you're trying to get a lot of money out the door very quickly, right? There's also a risk that, as much as I would love to see potholes fixed and children not having schools collapsing on them, getting...
It's very generous of you.
I was thinking the same.
No, I've got children. But actually, the more serious point here is trying to get the money out the door really quickly, right? And do good day-to-day or investment spending quickly in this 2 years. And I'm sure there are some problems that you can fix quickly. But actually, one of the risks of front-loading everything, and I think I'm with Paul, the biggest surprise was just the degree of front-load, like everything, big sugar rush the next 2 years and then sort of stand still. That next 2 years, you've got to get a lot done. And that's partly about capacity of, are there enough construction workers and planners? Is there enough capacity among civil servants to actually plan all this stuff? And there is a risk there that you kind of can't do enough good stuff with that money quickly enough, no?
I think that's definitely true on the investment project side of things. You've got to find the workers, you've got to find the projects, you've got to find the materials. You can't just magic into existence.
And perhaps that was even more surprising than the day-to-day funding, which we've just been talking about. It also looks, at least, like the investment spending is pretty front-loaded.
Yeah, almost entirely. A massive funding injection next year, then held approximately flat at that new higher level. I think that on that front, again, I think the political argument is the benefits take a long time to come through. If you're going to build a new, tram network in Leeds, the sooner you start building it, the sooner you see the benefits. If you don't start building it until the last year of the Parliament, you've got no chance. So I can see why they might want to go early. The danger is you try and get too much out the door too quickly. You throw good money after bad. You bid up prices in the construction sector, and we end up with, HS3 to nowhere. But there's, I think, I'm trying. I don't know if it's my sleep-deprived delirium. I'm sort of feeling optimistic. Let's give them a chance. Maybe they can. Maybe
and
they
can definitely fix potholes, right? I mean, there are plenty of those to go around.
Maintenance is easier. We've got
Yeah.
maintenance backlog in schools, hospitals, courts.
This is good news for all the guys out there who work on fixing potholes. This is good news for you, right?
Yeah,
prices up.
Your handymen, great budget for them, especially if they're self-employed,
and
drive
like
a petrol
drinking.
car and like beer, fantastic. But if you maybe you need a major project management firm to build a new bridge or a railway or even a new hospital. But fixing a couple of leaky roofs, investing in some new IT. We surely it's not beyond the wit of man to achieve something.
I think we should keep Ben in a state of sleep-deprived delirium more often. It seems to be working.
I like it.
Seems to be working remarkably well. It might be worth moving on, as it were, to try and put some of this together. So we've got some big tax rises. We've got quite a lot of money going into public services this year and next. And we've got a serious increase relative to plans, at least in terms of investment spending. And the Chancellor is also saying that she's meeting her new fiscal rules, and she's got two rules. One is to get the budget into current budget balance. In other words, to borrow only to invest. And she wants to achieve that by 2029-30. And once we get a couple of years hence, it'll be a 3-year rolling rule. In other words, she always wants to be planning to get there within 3 years. That's a pretty sensible rule, actually. I mean, we should say well done on that one. And the second rule is that debt should be falling in the 5th year of the forecast period, which will become a rolling, also like the other one, a rolling 3-year rule. Now, that sounds very like Jeremy Hunt's debt rule, except that Charles has redefined debt. So it's no longer what we've traditionally thought of as debt. It is now something called public sector net financial liabilities. We won't go into exactly what that means.
Future podcasts.
You'll be delighted to hear future podcasts. Ben and I and others have written about it if you want to look on the IFS website for details. But the key point is that despite everything we just said, despite these whacking great tax increases and despite our concerns about lack of spending growth after 2026, these rules are barely met. We're meeting the current budget balance rule by £10 billion. Sounds like a lot. That's out of well over £1 trillion of tax and spending.
It's tiny, yeah.
Every year. And we're meeting, even on this new definition of debt, we're meeting that rule by 16 billion, which is not that much more than what we described as the wafer-thin amount by which Jeremy Hunt was meeting his rule on the much more constraining debt. And on top of that, you take account of likely not increasing petrol duties, possible fact that interest rates are a bit higher than expected, and certainly any plans to increase spending after 2026, and these rules may well not be met after all.
But isn't it also worth saying that, even holding aside the exact fiscal rules and the pros and cons of different measures of debt, I mean, the kind of the debt we used to target still exists. It's still a thing in the world. It is now going up for longer, and that's a choice, but it comes with a risk, right? It comes with the risk of, and as the OBR set out, higher interest rates, and we've got a bigger stock of debt. Now, doesn't mean you don't want to do it because you think there's going to be some payoff to that, but it's not a free lunch, right? We've decided to borrow it longer.
We know it's not a free lunch because one of the big problems the government's got is the debt interest bill is so big. It's more than £100 billion in each of the following 5 years. It's something like 3.5% of national income. That's 1.5% of national income more than it averaged over the last 20 years. And that £100-odd billion that's being spent on debt interest isn't available to spend on other things. And in fact, we have to run what's called a primary surplus just to stop the debt spiralling ever upwards. That means we have to bring in, we've said this before in this podcast, but it's becoming more and more true, having to bring in more in tax and other revenues than we spend on everything other than servicing that debt pile.
It's worth pausing there, right? And it's one of the charts we've tweeted today that's a bit technical, but I think that primary surplus thing is really interesting, right? Because that's not how governments usually operate.
No, it's not.
We are absolutely not used to basically bringing in more revenue than we spend on all the good stuff we want.
We haven't done that since the turn of the millennium, when we only did it for a couple of years, and then we turned taps back on again.
Yes, the whole fiscal arithmetic is based inside it. We're going to start doing that. And whilst having this, what's 100 billion now? It's the second biggest department outside of health, would it be? Like bigger than all the other departments other than health?
Yeah, it must be. Certainly bigger than all the public service departments.
I think it's the combination, though, of the high debt interest bill with low growth that's so toxic. And it's that combination plus an ageing population, plus geopolitical tensions. I mean, you can't cut defence, plus a rising welfare bill for people who are out of work with health and disability problems. All those things together is just, that's why the inheritance is so bad. That's why things feel so tough.
Sleep-deprived euphoria has worn off pretty quickly.
I had a nap while Helen was talking a few seconds ago. It's just a really difficult situation to inherit. And I think that primary surplus point is an important one. And this is why whoever won the election was going to be raising taxes.
That's also why I think you said at the top, Paul, why it is commendable that they've prioritised investment to try to get some of this long-run growth. And yes, it isn't going to come during the forecast period, but we should try to look through that a little bit and think, in 10 years, at least try to do something so that in 10 years you do have some growth, because the problem ain't getting better without growth, right? So it's something you've got to do something as much as you can, really, to get the growth up.
And it's one of the reasons why it's going to be politically difficult, I think, because people will notice if they're having more money taken from them that is going back on public services, which is what we're saying. And of course, the other thing that's going to make people not very happy is if the Office of Budget Responsibility is correct in their forecasts, they're reckoning we're going to get very little income growth over the next 5 years, making this, if they're right, the worst parliament in modern history, with the single exception of the last parliament. So if that really happens, if we really get absolutely miserable income growth for yet another 5 years, I hate to think what kind of mood the electorate will be in come the next election.
I think the one thing that takes the edge off that a little bit, though, is that the reason why we're taxing people more and hitting their income is partly to spend more on public services, right? So maybe your take-home income isn't as high as it might have been, but at least you can get to see your GP. That seems to be the, you get benefits in kind.
Euphoria's coming back.
Yeah, well, if you look at, we can talk about this. If you look at the disgraceful, incomplete distribution analysis in the Treasury document.
God, yes, all right. Yes, please do.
But they model basically how people across different bits of the income distribution benefit or lose from the announcements. They conveniently exclude the employer national insurance increase, the biggest single measure, but they include the benefits to people from spending more on public services. And because people from lower income backgrounds make more use of the health service, not least because old people tend to have lower incomes and they tend to use a lot of healthcare, it looks like the lowest income groups are benefiting the most. Now, it's clearly an incomplete picture, but there is something to that, right? Because it's not just about the cash in your pocket, you also care about the public realm, public services, other things as well. So you have to look at both sides, I think.
Yeah, you're of course right. I mean, living standards are made up of far more than whatever your income happens to be, and an important part of it is your access, as you say, to decent education services, decent health services, your roads being cleaned, your potholes being filled in, and all those things. And we know that people really care about them, so you absolutely need to take them into account. But I'm glad you raised that point about the distributional analysis produced by the Treasury. I really don't think it helps with trust or transparency to produce a distributional analysis which says, look, almost everyone's getting better off because they're getting better public services, and we're going to ignore in all of this enormous tax increase that we've imposed, which we know will be reducing people's take-home pay. It's really not good, I think, for politics to do that.
Also, for some context, I mean, we had a guy who overnight knocked out like 3 or 4 versions of this, so it's not like it's possible to do this. Right? So the Treasury, yeah, exactly.
I mean, talk about trust. I agree with the broad point. I think that the number of people who are trawling through the Treasury appendix to find the distribution analysis, those guys are too far. They're too far gone. I think the thing that's probably more damaging to trust.
We're the ones that are too far gone.
We're too far gone. I think the thing that's potentially more damaging to trust is promising not to increase taxes and then increasing taxes at the first opportunity, having insisted you wouldn't have to. That I think is more dangerous. But the distribution analysis, it doesn't help.
I think that's got to be right. We are, in 40 minutes, which is about half as much time as Rachel Reeves spoke to deliver her budget. But that's partly because she talked about all sorts of... we could talk again about how budgets work. I mean, the number of trivial announcements that were crammed into that budget alongside the really big announcements was absurd. I mean, I'm afraid we haven't talked about the penny off a pint of draft beer, which
utterly irrelevant,
got the biggest cheer in Parliament, which just shows you how serious and how seriously MPs take all this stuff as they're cheering that alongside the massive tax and spending decisions that were being taken that will really impact our lives. But there was an awful lot of flummery, is that the right word?
I don't know. Is that a word?
If not, you can have it. Coin it. It's yours.
I definitely haven't coined it, but I may have used it in the wrong context. There was a lot of stuff in the budget which really didn't belong in a budget speech, as there always is. The Chancellor really did follow in the footsteps of many of her predecessors in cramming all sorts of extraneous announcements into that speech. I'm sure we're going to come back to things which we heard in the budget in future podcasts, but so that you don't get as bored listening to us as we got bored listening to the Chancellor, I think we'll bring this to a close at this point, as we have discussed the big tax and spending changes, our concerns about the way in which spending is front-loaded, our worries about the public finances, Helen's considerable concern about the lack of a tax strategy, which no doubt we will return to. But on that note, thank you for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work and indeed to see comprehensive analysis of this budget, please do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.